Hello and welcome back to another episode of Church is Stupid.
But
I'm Ruth.
I'm Elijah.
And I'm Sir Samuel.
Yup, that's Sam.
It's Sam.
You might have guessed that Sam tends to have some theme-picked names,
That's
and
my shtick.
it's your thing, Sam. And in response today, we're going to be talking about the Crusades. Woo!
Don't say woo.
No,
don't cheer.
No,
Don't
woos.
cheer after that.
But before we get started on that, I just wanted to give everyone who's listening a little bit of an update. We appreciate your patience as we haven't really been very consistent with uploading episodes, but just as for our, like I said, an update for what's been going on. Mine and Sam's mother has been in the hospital with COVID, and she's doing much better now, I would say. Right, Sam?
Mm-hmm.
But that just caused a lot of scheduling conflicts, and obviously we wanted to be there for my mom as much as possible. So hopefully we are back to a more consistent schedule, but we will see for now. And so thank you guys again just for your patience. So, yes, was that a good update there, Elijah?
No, you told me it's your mother, not mine.
That's very fair. Thanks, Mom, if you're listening. So, the Crusades. The Crusades are a very weird topic. I feel like it's almost something that I feel like is fake and comes from cartoons, even though I know it really happened. But it's just not talked about. It's more like a legend almost in my head, if that makes sense.
Very, very strange time period in history.
It is. Because it falls right in the medieval times.
I mean, so much of the Middle Ages and stuff too is like in their own right. The Crusades seem to just be such a crazier example, like, of something to come out of that time.
And
what an awful time to live in. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it didn't seem like a great time to exist in, at least in Europe.
Yeah.
Sam, what do you know about medieval times? What can you tell us about the background to our Crusades?
Have you ever been?
They sucked.
Medieval times?
No, I love medieval times.
I've never actually
that
been to
doesn't
medieval
suck.
times.
The medieval times, though, sucked, but not medieval times. Trademarked.
This hurt. For those of you who do not know, Medieval Times is a restaurant where you can watch a jousting tournament while eating.
It's a Renaissance fair, but in a restaurant, basically. That I've never been to.
I kind of liked it, but it's fine. So that was what that whole shtick was about.
Yeah.
Sam, so tell us about the Medieval Times, not the restaurant. Trademark.
Let me see. Put me on the spot. I don't know much about the medieval times.
Did you not study it? Sam is a history major.
Apparently.
At allegedly.
More modern history, thank you.
What's more modern than the medieval times?
Maybe half of the universe.
But Sam is a history major at U of M Flint and has been studying there for what?
This is my 5th year.
5th year? 5 years. Wow, I'm old. Anyhow.
You have to tell us.
So he is our resident history expert who
we should
is...
be asking you about the medieval times.
Resident...
Grandma.
Rude. And there's this token Ruth is old joke for today's episode.
Yeah, we've got it out of the way. We definitely won't make it again.
So, as Sam said, very eloquently, the medieval times were not a fun time to live in. Because there was lots of crazy stuff going on. The church seemed to have way more power than probably it should have.
Probably.
There was,
yeah.
The feudal system that existed was not great. And there was just a lot of bad stuff. I mean, then you add like plagues and stuff on there. Mm-hmm. Not a great time to be alive. But I feel like for some reason in my head, I almost separate Crusades from the medieval times just in my head because they feel like two totally different entities. But they take place really at the same time.
Well, actually, the Crusades take place at the end of the medieval.
Do they?
Yeah. It says right here the Middle Ages span roughly 1,000 years, ending between 1400 and 1450, and I think the last crusade was in like 1531.
Yeah, there was some I think there was some debate about when the Crusades ended, because like the official Crusades, or there was 8 that were deemed sort of the official ones ended in 1291, but then they kept going until the 16th century.
Yeah.
So, and those were just kind of more...
Well, I know the first 4 are like the main ones that I think, was it only the first 4 were the ones that were ever decreed by
the
the
Pope.
Pope?
It was the first 3 or the first 4.
Yeah.
And the very, 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 very first one
Yeah.
happened in 1096, but it was actually issued in 1095 by Pope Urban II. Yes. I had to double check that name 100 times because I didn't know that there was a Pope Urban the First, much less the second. But the whole premise of the Crusades, there are 4 things that essentially make it a crusade, right? So the Crusades were done to check the spread of Islam, to retake the Holy Land,
Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
And that-
Jerusalem, but also like there was a really big emphasis at the time on Christian relics
yeah.
and on where big Christian events happened.
Right.
So Jerusalem was obviously a very big one,
Yeah.
but also there were other components to it. So it was really a very prominent time with relics, which makes sense with the medieval times and with the medieval church because there would often be, and I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, but there would be churches selling like little chips of wood or nails and say, oh, this is from the cross.
Oh my gosh.
And would literally sell them for money in their church buildings. And so that just is that was a very commonplace thing, and it's one example of how important these relics really were to those people. So it was checking the spread of Islam, retaking the Holy Land, conquering pagan areas. So they wanted to take back, but they also wanted to conquer more of the pagan areas, and then retake Christian territories.
Yeah.
Because what was going on at the time was there was hundreds of years of Muslim expansion into these quote-unquote Christian territories. And so they had lost a lot of their land, essentially, and decided that because of this, it was time for them to reclaim all that was theirs, but then also continue on into other areas, which is kind of quite ironic when you think about it at its core, because they were angry because of the spread of Islam and Muslim territories into their territories, quote unquote, around there. But then they wanted to not only take it back, but continue taking other people's territories as well.
Yeah.
So it was like, from the Christian perspective of the Crusades, they're like, oh, we're super holy
Yeah.
and we're super just. But from the Islamic Muslim perspective, it was like, oh, but they're not. They can't be. But they were kind of doing the same thing.
Yeah, I don't really think that there were any good sides back in the day.
Not really.
I mean, it was territorial conquest was so like overt and constant.
Well,
Yeah.
and religion was really used as a cop-out for it. It was used
Yeah.
as a reason, but I feel like it's pretty safe to say when you have a religion that's based around an embodiment of
Well,
a human being who comes down to say, love your neighbor as yourself.
Well, even the first
Probably not the best justification.
Yeah.
even with the first crusade, correct? I guess I'm as far as I know. I mean, I'm not a history major myself, but from what I've been looking up, I mean that was like those Holy Lands and some of the other territories that were starting to get controlled or are taken over by the Turks at the time were part of the Byzantine Empire, and I believe that the first crusade was basically called to at the request of by the Byzantine Empire, like trying to ask the Pope if he could help out to help reclaim their territory. And through that, the Pope initiated this holy war with his idea for like taking Jerusalem back, or taking the Holy Lands back. So even then, it's like I I don't. As far as I know, I think that the initial request by the Byzantine Empire was really more of a, hey, our territory keeps getting taken. Is there anything you can do to help? And then through that, it turned into or became a holy war through the Pope initiating it with his own, I don't know, ideal. You know what I mean? His own agenda, I suppose.
Which happened through the Council of Clement.
Okay. Yeah.
That met in, I believe, 1095. So yes, that was essentially how it got started initially, and was that merging.
Because I know that like religious and military like organization back in the day was just so strangely like entangled.
Yep.
And because it's not like it wasn't one nation going with the Crusades. It was warriors and knights from like different European nations coming together and crusading together, and then I think eventually against each other sometimes too, or with their own internal like struggles and stuff. It wasn't like a very clean cut thing.
Well, it's so interesting, I guess, for me, because the Council of Clement was essentially a gathering of bishops, particularly bishops from the southern France, and I think about a lot of my like every year the United Methodist Church does an annual conference, right? So a whole bunch of pastors get in one room, and every 4 years there's the council, or like the bishops get together with representatives as well at general conference. And I cannot imagine them talking about something like war. Usually what we talk about is like pensions. Like you sit in a room and then it's like, okay, we're gonna vote on our pensions again. Woo! Yeah. Like tackling something like sending an entire nation, it kind of baffles me because it's just so different from how I see like these councils now, you know what I mean? But it was probably about the equivalent for that time of something like a general conference.
Yeah.
And so I find it incredibly odd, just that entanglement. And I think particularly perhaps because we come from a nation which at least on paper declares the separation of church and state.
Right.
It's very weird to think about a church having that power. But at the same time, the popes had the power to essentially almost dethrone rulers if they wanted to. They could take a lot of power. And so the fact that they were the ones kind of leading the charge, and one of the things that was decided at that council particularly was putting crosses on all of their like armor.
Yeah.
And making sure that it was very clear who was the quote unquote good guys in their holy war. So,
and what's crazy is that this happened many times. Like we really we're focusing on the first one mostly because I mean it's the start of everything. But
well, and I think what's really interesting about how long the Crusades go on and how, I mean, quite frankly, awful they really were, is that there were like small pockets of people who would just go on their own throughout this whole time in the name of the crusade. But they weren't formal crusades. So even though there's like these 8 formal crusades, there's a whole bunch of like little mini peasant uprisings or random where people would go and try to one of the big, I guess, lies or goals of these people were to get gold, to earn money, and to do that they would go under the guise of it being a crusade, so that way they didn't have to feel bad doing all of the horrible things that they did. In the pursuit of that.
Only the first 4 crusades were ever officially like declared and launched by popes. After those 4, I mean, I guess I don't really know the details about really anything past the 4 for the most part, but I know that like different monarchs and stuff would launch crusades like aimed at like maybe Egypt and like stuff, and I think that they were almost all unsuccessful. But like the first 4 were the ones that the Pope kept declaring to try to, with the intent, or at least with the, said intent of like taking back the Holy Lands, but that's not always, I think, what was done by the forces that were actually gathered, at least in some of the later ones too.
And Sam, you were saying you know a little bit more about the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, the Byzantine Empire at this time was like the crappy version of the Roman Empire.
Was this like post?
This is like the Pope, like part of it was to get the Holy Land back, but part of it was to get more territory, to get more power.
Yeah.
Well, because the Byzantine Empire, I mean, ever since the fall of Rome, people have been trying to recapture that, we're the Roman Empire. We have this authority, this ability, because it's been seen, it's been seen as one of the most quote-unquote successful empires, which is quite ironic when you look at the history of a lot of Eastern cultures who have dynasties that have lasted for a long time. Dynasties. Sorry, Sam.
Dynasties?
Yeah, you did sort of say dynasties.
It's fine. It's all fine.
You've been watching a lot of Doctor Who the past day or two.
I have. I've been watching Doctor Who, so you're going to have to forgive me.
Dynasty.
But dynasties that lasted much longer, that were much more successful, I would say, than the Roman Empire. But you see that bleed into the architecture, particularly here in the States, all the time. A lot of our big government buildings are built intentionally are designed after that Roman Empire look.
Right.
To try to proclaim ourselves in a subtle, quote unquote, way as the next Roman Empire, the next most successful empire. So the Byzantine Empire was likely trying to recapture a lot of those glory days of the Roman Empire. But unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, they were not as successful, and they were not really good at it.
Yeah.
They weren't very good, no.
And so that's part of what gets mixed up. And particularly, we find the merging of religion and the Roman Empire in Constantine, and in his proclamation to, it was Constantine, correct, who made it the official
You're
religion?
The city, right?
Constantinople?
Yeah, okay.
No, I'm not talking about Constantinople. But there became part of the Roman Empire eventually grew into identifying with Christianity. And so the Byzantine Empire, it makes sense that in an effort to recapture pieces of that Roman Empire would try to merge that religious aspect with the governmental aspect.
Yeah. Well, in the Byzantine Empire too to make it clear, the Byzantine Empire was not under Catholicism. They weren't under like the rule or overview or oversight as much of like the Pope. Like, they were Orthodox mainly, or at least, and I don't know if it, again, because actual like the military and territorial control was so crazy and complicated back then. I don't know, like in terms of influence, how much they were under like the Pope and the and like the Catholicism at the time, but like the Byzantine Empire was like predominantly Orthodox too, which made it, again, the request for the Pope to help them take back what their territory, in a sense. It's just another aspect of it that made it so bizarre.
Well, and it's important to remember Catholicism is not as we know it now. There really
Correct.
was no other option. It was Orthodox or Catholic, which Catholic is actually just a word that means universal. Yeah. So it was, quote, the universal church, and Orthodox means right teaching. So they named themselves that as a way of saying we have the right teaching.
Yeah, right.
And so those were the early expressions of the church. So it makes sense that they would say something like right teaching and universal, because
and
those were expressions. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify that.
That's a very good point. It's kind of one of the reasons why the Crusades are so bizarre that I think it's perfectly normal and right to look at them as like, man, none of that should have ever happened. Yeah. But I don't know if necessarily it's always as reductive as people make it seem, because for the Pope to essentially like
sanction.
For the Catholic Church of that time to sanction a war with and almost at the request of like the Orthodox Church at that time for the purpose of reclaiming Jerusalem and that Holy Land. I believe, I mean, I don't know the people in power what they really wanted and what their agendas were, but a lot of the people who did go to fight for that really were doing it for actual spiritual reasons. Whether or not you could say they were right or wrong is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that they were right or justified in necessarily.
Elijah defends the Crusades.
Definitely not what I'm saying.
Stupid.
But I do think that people were going into that war for actual spiritual reasons as well.
So yeah, and on that, one particularly important piece for what got the Crusades going was that something we have lost in a lot of our modern Christianity is this notion of what's called a pilgrimage. And a pilgrimage is essentially going to a holy land to be closer to God, in a sense. Most of the time now, I think it's more associated with the Islamic religion, and so it's, I don't know if that's why pilgrimage has kind of fallen off in the Christian world or what it is, but particularly at that time, with the emphasis of relics, on all of that, it was important to them to take pilgrimages to the Holy Land and see where Christ died and walk where Christ walked. And so prior to the Council of Clement, they actually were hearing stories of people being attacked on their way to the Holy Land and on these pilgrimages, and them being incredibly dangerous. And so you can see how people would start to get whipped up and get angry, because if it was really important for them to take a pilgrimage and people were keeping them from doing it, then it was a matter of, well, how am I going to grow in my spiritual faith?
Yeah, well, which is really funny because in the Third Crusade, I don't know a lot about how it actually played out or how long it lasted before like the Fourth Crusade, but there was actually a treaty that was made called the Treaty of, I don't know if the city is pronounced Jaffa or Jaffa or whatever. I think it's Jaffa, but the Treaty of Jaffa, which basically was a treaty that was drafted between like the Muslim occupying force and I'm guessing like the Byzantine Empire or something, like the other force. I don't know exactly like what name would have been put on it, but it was basically a treaty that was drafted that kept Jerusalem under that Muslim control, but would allow Christian pilgrims and merchants to visit the city if they kept the peace. Now, I have no idea what that actually like looked like, and how it was really kept and how long it lasted by any means. But on your note of saying, of talking about how pilgrimage was so important back then and why that was a big reason why the Crusades were sort of drafted in the first place, like the Third Crusade sort of ended with a treaty that revolved around keeping pilgrims, pilgrims sounds weird because I'm thinking of like American history now, but keeping Christian pilgrims like safe if they wanted to go into the Holy Lands. Like that's what that revolved around at the time, and that's how that crusade sort of ended as well. So just that was supposed to be like a piggyback off your point, but I kind of derailed, I think. But
well, and again, it's ironic because then the Christians would not want the other faiths taking pilgrimages to Jerusalem.
Well, and then
so it is kind of that again. It's that ironic twist.
And then even after that, the Pope initiated the fourth one still because he wanted Jerusalem to be taken anyway.
But it was an attempt at stopping the wars and the Crusades. Because again, like I said, while there might have only been 3, which I guess I say only very loosely, they still had pockets of people who would come do it all the time, like randomly. And it's very just an odd time in history. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it on the podcast is because it's one of those pieces of Christian history that I feel like is really, really breezed over for the sake of making it sound like they weren't that bad, quote unquote. But they really kind of were. Yeah,
we're talking about all this stuff between like reasons why the Crusades happened and territorial control being a norm, but easy to forget. Much like what happens today, too. That in the midst of all of this, regardless of how much you break down decisions behind it, like it results in many, many, many people dying. Like before, during, and after. It's not like it's the only period of time during that where there was war and casualties, but I mean, this was a very particular set of time that I feel like you could probably say also didn't help any sort of global relationship between the Christian and Muslim community, even though much like the Christian, if you want to say community at the time, was split, into like the Catholic Church and the Byzantine Church. Much like that, it's the Muslims also had a lot of different like warring tribes and differences amongst themselves too. But like, I don't really know where I was going with that. The whole point is like it's amongst all of this and this reasoning, you have to remember how many people lost their lives during it, like innocent civilian and people who were fighting too.
Well, and Sam, as you know, in world history, that doesn't just end with their deaths. It doesn't end, and you hinted at that, Elijah, that it leads to prejudice, it leads to stereotypes, it leads to hundreds of years, thousands in some cases, of warring hurts over specific areas. I mean, look, even now, Jerusalem isn't exactly not fought over today. It's not exactly a place of no turmoil. And a lot of that fighting can be traced back to, I know, I'm not going to get too in depth on that one, but
I don't even know.
There's, it's just interesting. I think we forget sometimes it's easy to look at the ramifications of these situations and saying, okay, yeah, lots of people died, but history was changed. People's perspectives have been changed over hundreds and thousands of years of one another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's easy to view history, especially things like this, as just like relatable fiction, but it's not. Like these things really happened.
And it still impacts us today.
Yeah. Yeah.
They could be the first world wars too. A lot of people say that.
Do they really?
Yeah, that there's like 7 or 8 world wars before World War One, and I think the Crusades were one of them. I could be wrong though.
I mean,
Also,
it would
the
sort of
Fifth
make
Crusade
sense.
was not in 1571; it was in 1271.
As I say, it says the
Flipped
8th
that
one.
2 and that 5.
I did.
It
That
said,
would sort of make sense, though. I mean, with I guess because different European nations were getting together for Crusades, but
well, and Jerusalem was still a pretty big global hub of trade at that time, right?
well, and like
Trade actually increased like significantly after the Crusades.
well, and I know that like Egypt played a big role too in helping some of those Muslim nations take back because after the First Crusade, when the Holy Lands were taken. In the second one, I believe, I think that that Egypt, the Egyptian Empire, helped the Turks take those back from. Yeah. I think they were called Crusader states after like the first one. They helped take them back too. So, yeah, I mean, multi-nation. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, I mean, you could almost argue it was more global than a lot of the world wars, which I think is the point you were making. Yeah. Because with Jerusalem being, especially didn't the spice trail, the Silk Road? The Silk Road, sure. Why do I have spice in my... Didn't that go through Jerusalem?
I don't think so.
No, I thought there was
more like Asia, Chinese area.
I thought I thought Jerusalem was like, and this is why we have Sam. I thought Jerusalem was sort of the connecting point between Asia and Europe and Africa.
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
Like in
just
that,
the Middle East in general was, but yeah.
Yep.
Which is
But that was a prominent city there.
Yeah, it's also like I guess. The Crusades kind of had a reverse effect where it spread both Christianity and Islam to different people. So Islam also saw a rise,
right?
In people that were like, and I don't know how to say it, but like Crusades are obviously terrible, but like a lot of people say that the increase in knowledge of both religions kind of is what led to the Renaissance.
Oh, I would never have known that.
Yeah, because the Renaissance takes place. The Renaissance is right after the medieval ages, so
yeah, right.
And we will talk more about some of this history and move forward with more of why we brought up the Crusades on this next episode, not next week's episode, but this next episode of Church is Stupid.
Comma but.
I'm Ruth.
I'm Elijah.
I'm Sam.
And we hope that you have a great week.